More breaking news as well this evening from the White House. With less than a month left in office, President Trump also has issued a wave of pardons and executive clemencies.
20 people in all either pardoned or had their sentences commuted. And some big names in this you actually may recognize tonight. Two former members of Congress, Duncan Hunter from California, Chris Collins from New York, charged with financial crimes, both getting full pardons from President Trump today. Also on the list, two people charged with lying to the FBI in the Mueller Russia probe, George Papadopoulos and Alex van der Zwaan.
Joining us now is Amherst College professor Prof Sarat, an expert in law and jurisprudence. I appreciate your time tonight here on NewsNation. First of all, your reaction to the scope of these latest pardons tonight.
Well, I think the pardon spree has just begun. I think this is the president's first act in what will be a multi-act play. These pardons really run the gamut from people who are celebrities and well-connected to people who are completely unknown to the American public. So I don't think that anyone should be surprised. The president loves the clemency power. He loves it because it's his alone. He doesn't have to consult with Congress. He doesn't have to get the permission of anyone to grant clemency. So I'm not surprised to see this pardon spree beginning so close to Christmas.
It's also interesting to see kind of the through line for some of these pardons, today's and others, in terms of their link to the Mueller investigation. We know certainly the president has been the most vocal critic about that from the very beginning, but we have Roger Stone, who's benefited from this. We have Mike Flynn, who's benefited from this, and today George Papadopoulos and Alex van der Zwaan, both of whom pleaded guilty to lying to Mueller investigators here. So this is the president with this awesome power that he and any other president would have, the pardon power here, chipping away at that 2-year Mueller investigation, even from those who pleaded guilty as part of it.
I think that actually, if you look at these 20 pardons, these 20 exercises of clemency, you can see three principles that the president was articulating and was guided by. First is revenge against Mueller. So you're absolutely right. The pardons of Papadopoulos and Van Zwaan, those are revenge against the Mueller investigation. He's trying to use the pardon power to, in a way, stick it to Mueller and unwind the work that he did. The second principle that you see in these pardons is that it helps to be well connected. Duncan Hunter and Congressman Collins from New York are not people who you would have thought on the face of it deserved a pardon. But lobbying by the president's allies in Congress produced that for him. And the third principle, I think, that you see in these pardons, and here you have to look at the pardons of the border guards and of the employees of Blackwater. What holds those clemencies together is the president's indulgence of the use of violence on the side of his political causes. The two border guards had been convicted of shooting an unarmed and undocumented immigrant and then covering it up. And the 4 Blackwater guards had been convicted of a really gruesome shooting in Iraq, in which they let loose gunfire on innocent women and children. So I think there's something that you can see operating that gives a kind of coherence to this group of pardons. And let me say one other thing. The pardon power is vast and allows the president to exercise it in whatever way the president sees fit. And how a president uses that pardon power tells us a lot about what the president values, what the president cares about, and sends powerful signals to the American people and American society about the kinds of behaviors that the president thinks are forgivable.
And Professor Sarat, in addition to those cases that you just mentioned, and there is a lot of coherency in those. But I'm looking at another example here of one of the pardons tonight. Steve Stockman, he was a congressman in 2018, convicted of misuse of charitable funds. He was ordered to pay $1 million in restitution. When you're looking at a case like that or some of the others, what now happens to the victims in these cases? Does it just go away? I mean, this was a sentence that was commuted. What's next after a person is pardoned or commuted?
Well, from the perspective of the victims of these crimes, there is nothing that they can do. The president's power is unreviewable. It's not that anybody can go to court and ask the courts to unwind these exercises of clemency. And you make a very important point. When the president commutes a sentence or pardons someone, the president is overriding the considered judgment of prosecutors, of judges, of juries, appellate courts. And the president is also exercising a judgment that may be very damaging to the victims of the crimes that he is now forgiving.
Before we let you go, I'm just curious, historically, your perspective on clemency in time, how it has changed over different presidencies who, of course, all have this authority. Have you seen it shift in recent decades over the course of the last century?
Oh, for sure. I mean, if you go back to the beginning of the 20th century, you see that the pardon power was used a lot. And the pardon power was regarded at that point as really a kind of gift, an act of grace. People never talked then about deserving pardons. A pardon was something you didn't deserve. It was given to you as an act of grace. That conception of pardoning as an act of grace has really diminished. Now we do talk, as I did, about people who deserve pardons. And another thing to note is that despite the fact that President Trump really loves the pardon power, and I think he really does because it is unchecked, President Trump has not used it very often at all. He's used it much less than his immediate predecessors have used it. When President Obama, for example, exercised the pardon power, exercised the clemency power, it was often to make a statement about undue harshness in criminal sentencing. He was particularly interested in undoing some of the damage that had been done by the war on drugs. President Trump, as I said, seems to be guided by a whole nother set of principles. But stay tuned. As I said, this is just the beginning. We can expect to see more pardoning, more grants of clemency, more commutations in the waning days of the Trump administration. Certainly, there's reason to suspect he will be looking with favor at people like Rudy Giuliani and may use the pardon power to spare his family members and maybe even himself of criminal prosecution.
We are out of time, but we'll have you back to talk about preemptive pardons at some point. Professor Austin Sarat, expert in law and jurisprudence with Amherst College, thank you for joining us tonight.
Thanks for having me.